Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to IDG Live. Today we are looking at Gimli, who I will admit is one of my favourite members of the Fellowship. He is a character that has grown on me. I did like him when I first read The Lord of the Rings, but the more times I read his story through this, the more I come to realise that Tolkien has made him the character, I think, who has gone on the greatest, within the Fellowship, the greatest character journey out of all of the members of the Fellowship, the greatest character development, and also quite often the one who is the most emotionally engaged in what's going on, which is, I think, quite astonishing when you consider how we generally conceive of dwarves in fantasy literature as being quite closed down, very focused. To have somebody who is openly emotionally engaging in what's going on and open with his feelings to others, I think that's pretty amazing. But let's start as I try to do, with a little bit of an overview of who he is. We all know a little bit about him, obviously, from the books and the film, but what can we learn when we get a little bit deeper? He was born in exile, is probably the first thing to say. He was born in and grew up in the Blue Mountains. Now, if you imagine the map of Middle-earth in your head, and you've got like the Misty Mountains in the middle. If you go across a little bit to the west, then you get to Rivendell, and then Bree, and then the Shire. If you keep going west all the way to the coast, and up a little bit, you get to a mountain range, which is the Blue Mountains. Now, the Blue Mountains were once home to a couple of very noble dwarven nations, but they had sort of gone into disrepair more recently. And that was where most of the dwarves who fled from Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, when Smaug took it, they ended up there. And so that is where he grew up. He will have been filled from his youth with these thoughts, these memories, not really memories for him, but the stories, the legends of these great old dwarven empires, these great old dwarven realms that had gone, that they had been cast out of by Durin's Bane, by Smaug, by dragons. And when he reaches the grand old age of 62, that's when Thorin, the king of Durin's people, Durin's folk, he decides, that's it. I'm going to try to retake the Lonely Mountain. I'm going to try to retake Erebor. And he sets off with his company of dwarves. This is the story of the Hobbit. Gimli wants to go along too. Gimli is not allowed. Gimli is considered too young at the time to be going along. He is 62. Dwarves, for context, live to 250-ish. So he's, well, you can probably do your own maths, but early 20s or so, a young man, a young dwarf. And they felt that he was too young to be going on this kind of adventure. So he stays at home. Now, he is, we have to say, not just like normal dwarf. He was brought up as part of the wider dwarven royal family, the wider Longbeard royal family. His father was Gloin, who we know from The Hobbit. Oin, his uncle, also went along on that mission. Balin was a cousin. If you go a little bit further, you will get Thorin also as a cousin. He could trace his family tree all the way up to the first Durin. So he is part of the dwarven 1%. Anyway, the quest for Erebor goes ahead, and miracle upon miracles, Smaug is killed. They can retake their homeland of the Lonely Mountain, and he and many others from the Blue Mountains head all the way across, long journey eastwards to recolonize the Lonely Mountain, along with many more dwarves from the Iron Mountains, Iron Hills. So then he spends the next few years in what must have been quite comfortable, prosperous times for him. His father gained 1/14 of Smaug's treasure. That was part of the contract, which means that his father was incredibly wealthy, as was his uncle. We're told that Erebor grew strong relationships with the peoples around them, and they grew prosperous and strong. And that is the world that he grew up in, from a young man until healthy middle age. At which point the dwarven happiness is disrupted by an emissary from Sauron, because a lot has been going on in the outside world while the dwarves have been happily rebuilding their kingdom of Erebor, and an emissary from Sauron arrives and basically wants to get some information about Baggins and the One Ring, and the dwarves are obviously very suspicious. And added to which, they're also starting to get a bit concerned about Balin and Oin, Gimli's uncle, who had headed off with a small expedition over to try and retake Moria. They'd retaken Erebor, why not try and retake Moria? For 5 years, all had been good with that expedition. They encountered some resistance, but they'd overcome it. They'd re-established the kingdom there, and then everything went quiet. So they had a couple of things that they were just a little bit concerned about. What happened to Balin's expedition? What was it that Sauron was after? And so the king sends off one of his most faithful retainers, family members, extended family members, Gloin, Gimli's father, to go to the wisest person they know, who is Elrond. And this time he does bring his son. As I say, by this point, Gimli is in his middle ages. And so they head off all the way over to Rivendell. They pass over the Misty Mountains. And when they get there, they find that lots of other people have been gathering there. It's not just them, but also we get Legolas, who has arrived from Northern Mirkwood, from the elves. We also get Boromir, who's arrived all the way from Gondor, from Minas Tirith. We've got Gandalf and the hobbits who've arrived, who've come over from the west, from the Shire. And we get the council, which is basically sharing bits of information that everybody's got. Boromir brings his story about what's going on down in Gondor. Gimli or Gloin manages to share their story about what's been going on with them. Legolas shares his story. They've lost Smeagol, Gollum, who had been their prisoner. And Gandalf tells his story, and the hobbits tell their story. And this understanding comes about what's going on. At which point the decision is made. The ring is going to go east. They're going to try and destroy it. Frodo takes it. Sam is added straight away to the party because they couldn't separate them. And then it's a matter of who goes with them. We don't actually see this next part, but the decision is made. Elrond, in his wisdom, says, okay, so we need people from each of these different races just to be representative. And so a decision is made. A dwarf goes. At this point, Gloin's probably thinking he's a bit too old and past it. Gimli, however, is in the prime of his life. So Gimli joins the fellowship. At the back of his mind, he's probably thinking, we've got to go back past the Misty Mountains. Maybe this is my time to be discovering what happened to my uncle, what happened to Balin. So they head off. And eventually, of course, they do head through Moria. And Gimli, understandably, is the person who is most supportive of them going through Moria. At which point we get the first of these moments that show us his emotional engagement with the story. Because they head there. They go through, and first of all, this isn't what he was expecting. He had been hoping, it would appear, that by this point Balin had turned this back into its glory, but it's still dark, dank, gloomy. So some of his expectations about what to expect have already been busted. Then they towards the far end of Moria, they come across Balin's tomb, and he hears what had happened. They get the book with the story of what happened. He learns of the death of his uncle as well, who'd been killed by the monster that they only just managed to avoid on the way into Moria. And he doesn't really get much of a chance to mourn for his dead family members before the orcs and then the Balrog attack. But still, he takes the lead. He leads the fellowship across the bridge. Gandalf obviously is there in the rear guard, protecting against the Balrog, but he is the person who takes the lead. And we have to say, for understandable reasons, he has been taking a lot of the lead all the way through Moria. Gandalf remembers, has been through Moria, but when he needs some understanding of it, then he always turns to Gimli. On the other side, Gimli, still feeling the weight of this sorrow and loss, comes to, or within walking distance of, this great dwarven holy site that he then takes Frodo and Sam off to see. But Aragorn's hurrying them along. He says, we have to escape. We have to escape before it gets dark, because the orcs are going to be all over us. Where do we go? The only safe place is Lothlorien. And Lothlorien is somewhere Gimli does not want to go, because the elves, particularly the elves of Lothlorien, hate the dwarves. He does not want to go there. He says, I do not, if this is the only way, then okay, I'll go there, but I do not want to go there. Character growth, he goes. He goes, and when they do encounter the elves, we get this instance of what can probably only be called anti-dwarf racism. The elves immediately say, okay, well, all of you are very welcome except that dwarf. That dwarf can come under sufferance, perhaps, with your recommendation, but he has to be blindfolded. We do not trust him. And it's to the credit of the rest of the fellowship that they say, okay, if you're going to blindfold him, blindfold us as well. But Gimli, he grumbles, but he carries on, because this is what has to happen. And while he's in Lothlorien, that's when he sets eyes on Galadriel. And he, I mean, we often think of it as like him having a crush on Galadriel or something. That's not the picture that Tolkien is trying to put here. He's trying to give us the impression that Tolkien was a lover of all kinds of ancient legends and lore, and we often overlook quite how much he loved Arthurian legends. He translated a couple of different Arthurian legends, and it's this chivalric love, which is what he's trying to present here. This idea that Gimli is presenting himself as a champion for Galadriel. It's a pure love. And when we get to them leaving Lothlorien, and Galadriel's handing out gifts, and she says, well, what gift do you want? And he says, I do not want a gift from you. I don't need a gift from you. When she pushes him and says, okay, don't ask for a gift, but is there anything that you would like? You're not asking for it, but, you know, what is there anything you'd like? And he's kind of like, oh, well, okay, I would love to have a strand of your hair. And she gives him 3 strands of her hair. We'll get into the detail of the symbolism of what that means a bit later. I've got some questions about that from my patrons, but he takes this as a greater gift than anything else he could possibly have. The story continues. They move on. They head down the Anduin. The party separates. The 3 of them, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, end up together hunting for the people who have captured Merry and Pippin. And from this moment on, every time anyone says anything remotely bad about Galadriel, Gimli immediately jumps to her defense. Don't you say a word against her. She's the most amazing person ever. He is being her champion there against the Rohirrim, against anyone who says anything bad against Galadriel. They come to the edges of Fangorn, and again he says, I don't want to go. I've heard terrible things about Fangorn. This is not my world. This is I belong in cave systems. This is I've heard bad rumors about what happens here. But he goes on anyway. Through to the other side. Eventually they find Merry and Pippin. They get caught up in the defense, the Battle of the Hornburg, Helm's Deep, as we know it from the films, and he has this sort of friendly banter with Legolas about who will kill more, and he wins. And it's probably worth saying, it's often presented as being this is a close run thing. There was only one difference in their orc kill counts, but Legolas had something like a 20 orc kill advantage before they came into combat at all. Just he had a ranged weapon. He was just shooting at them from the walls. All of Gimli's kills of orcs were in hand-to-hand combat with his axe, and that, I think, makes him, we don't rate him as much often, but that probably makes him one of the finest warriors in all of Middle-earth. He just was a machine there, taking on nearly 100 and killing nearly 100 of the baddies on his own is an incredible feat. But during this, we don't get to see it in the film, but during this in the book, he and a few others find themselves escaping back out through this cave system behind the Hornburg. And this becomes known as the Glittering Caves. Finally, he's in his element. This is a place that he loves. This is a place which is amazing. He can see the potential here for mining it, crafting it, shaping it, making it into a thing of beauty for the dwarves. But he has to leave it. He has to go on. So he doesn't linger there. He carries on going. Then Aragorn gets this basically a bit of advice from Elrond via Elrond's sons, saying you need to go through the paths of the dead. You need to go where the army of the dead are. And he heads off. And Legolas says he goes too, and Gimli also goes. Tolkien shows us one person who is scared here, and that's Gimli. But he carries on. And I think that again shows us, this is Tolkien showing us the person who's most in touch with their emotions, that allows us as a reader to see that this is actually a scary place. Legolas, Aragorn, the others who are heading in there, maybe they aren't scared, but if we didn't have that feeling of jeopardy going into it, then it wouldn't have been such a scary thing. They're going into somewhere called the Paths of the Dead. There are ghostly warriors there. Nobody returns from there. This is horrific stuff. And Tolkien uses Gimli to show us that. But they go through. The rest of the story, Gimli shows his mettle, he shows his strength and glory, but he's not the main focus of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, where he certainly holds his own, nor indeed the final battle outside the Black Gates. After all of this has ended, the war is finished. At this point, we start to see that this friendship has grown with Legolas through everything. It did not start out well, understandably, because Gimli will have had from the very beginning this very clear understanding. Legolas's dad imprisoned Gimli's dad unfairly. That was in The Hobbit. That was what happened. And when Legolas's dad thought that Smaug was dead, the first thing he did was set off with his army to try and capture all of the dwarven gold. So Gimli has not got a good impression of Legolas's dad, and let's not forget Legolas was there too. He will have been a part of all of this, so there already was a bit of friction. And through this, Gimli has gone through this amazing journey. He's seen and understood the deaths of his close family members. He's been taken to places he never wanted to go to. He's been confronted with things that he is personally afraid of. He's confronted with overt discrimination against him personally because of the fact that he is a dwarf. And through all of this, he somehow manages to get to the point where his new best buddy is the person he was most suspicious of at the end, because he's been through this character growth. And he and Legolas sort of go on this road trip. Legolas shows him some great forests. He shows Legolas the glittering caves that he saw there behind the Hornburg. Gimli, with Legolas, helps rebuild some of Gondor. Then Gimli establishes a colony in the Glittering Caves, and he becomes the Lord of the Glittering Caves, before finally, at the very end, he and Legolas sail westwards. Gimli, by this point, is an old man. This is much debated, but it is basically he is there as a gift, really, from Galadriel to see her for one last time. He has been her champion all this time. So that is Gimli. That is, for me, as I say, this is the character who has the most growth. Tolkien sets up we often think about how Tolkien creates the stereotypes. He creates the tropes of what an elf is and what a dwarf is, and how they're at loggerheads, and he creates the history for why these two people should be forever mistrustful of each other. But what we don't give him enough credit for is the moment that he creates that trope, he immediately subverts it by having Gimli be this character who should hate the elves but grows to have a best friend who is an elf. So Tolkien is setting up the tropes and then undermining them right from the get-go, which is an astonishing thing, and Gimli is the way that he shows that. We often think of the hobbits as being Tolkien's way of giving us a way into this story, of being the normal people. When we're surrounded by all these kings and wizards and eternal elves and things like that, the hobbits are our way into this. They're the people we can relate to. But we don't always have the hobbits. And when we don't, the character that Tolkien leans on the most is Gimli. He is the character who we see the emotions. He's the character that we see showing the grit and determination to carry on even when they do not want to. With characters like Aragorn and Legolas, we don't really see that vulnerable side as much. Okay, so that's my overview of Gimli. As always, I will frame this around questions from my patrons. I've got already a few questions in the chat, I see. We'll get to them, and I'll try and pick up as many of them as I can. Kate Whitehorse, thank you very much, saying loads of love to Robert and the Mods. Sounds like a rock band. It does, actually. It's quite a good band name. Martin S., saying good evening, Robert, and sadly unrelated to Tolkien. Sorry, rest in peace, Tina Turner. Yeah, well, absolutely. That was very sad news. I think it was last night for me when that news came through. Maura Lee saying just a show of immense love and support for the content merch, fabulous stories. I appreciate you with all my heart. Hugs to handsome Dan, your dog. Thank you very much, Maura. Great to see you. Let's. A question also from Seek and Destroy 99 saying, did the dwarves die out in the Fourth Age? So the short answer is no. This is one of those things where we don't get huge amounts about what happens in the fourth age. The fourth age, for those who don't know where all the different ages are, the third age goes up basically to the destruction of the ring. The fourth age is what happens after the Lord of the Rings. And in the fourth age, what happens with the dwarves is we get a few little hints. We know that we know what Gimli does. We know that he sets up this colony in the Glittering Caves. We know that the dwarves do go back to Moria. And I mean, I wish I had the exact quote from Tolkien in front of me, but because it's quite subtle but beautiful. But basically, he says, and they dug deeper and they lived their best lives. And that's where they fade into the realms of myth and history. That's the kind of feel that we have from him, is that they don't disappear in the fourth age. It's just that if you leave dwarves alone for long enough, they will keep on underground and digging deeper and deeper and building grander and grander things, but perhaps not engaging so much with the outside world. Maura Lee, thank you so much for the super sticker. Mark Shees is saying, I wonder how much Gimli's kind of crush on Galadriel helped him overcome his elven skepticism and for his friendship with Legolas. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a part of it. I think when he reached Lothlorien, for me, this was quite a tipping point for him, because I think he'd seen and been affected by understanding his uncle is dead, his cousin is dead, his hopes and dreams for that re-established kingdom in Khazad-dûm was gone. They'd lost Gandalf as well. And then he arrives in Lothlorien, on the borders of Lothlorien, and then he comes up and he thinks, I don't want to go there. This is not the place to go. This is not a place of safety for dwarves. And initially he's proven right. Initially, the elves are just completely against him. Yeah, you guys can come in. We trust you. We've heard of you, Legolas. We know you, Aragorn. This dwarf, no. So when he gets there to meet Galadriel, she is the one who is kind. She is the one who, more than anything else, it's not just that he has this, as you say, this kind of crush. It's not just that he loves her in this pure way. It's that she actually shows him kindness when he was expecting intolerance. And that has to have had a huge impact on him. And that allowed him the time to grieve, and also the time to see beauty where he did not know that beauty existed. So I think that allowed this friendship with Legolas to grow. We see a few hints of it earlier on, but really it's only later on that the two of them start getting closer. Martin S. saying, dwarves are short, but they seem to make up for it in width, and I don't refer to fat. They don't seem to have the hobbit lack of physical strength compared to men. Aula made them sturdy indeed. Yeah, indeed. So the backstory to dwarves, which Tolkien gives us, is that we have to remember this world of Tolkien's has a creator god, and underneath that we have a sort of a pantheon. And elves and humans were part of the original plan, part of the original creation. Then Aula, part of the pantheon, Aula the smith, made dwarves because he was about a spirit of creativity. And there's a bit of a backstory going on there, but eventually they get given the breath of life and they come to life, which means that they're always slightly different. They're always viewed as, if not outsiders, by elves and men, but they're definitely different. People don't understand them as well. So that means that they do operate in a different way. The rings of power affect them in a different way. And Tolkien doesn't. He has a famously kind of soft magic system. He doesn't explain exactly how it works. So Tolkien doesn't explain all of this in great detail, but we're just left to see it, and we're supposed to see a mystery there. Let's go to George R.R. Tolkien saying, "Salutations, Robert. Salutations to you too, sir. I was wondering, did Gimli ever get to live in Khazad-dûm, or was that way before his time?" So yes, it was way before his time. It was the year 1980 of the Third Age when Durin's Bane basically kicked the dwarves out from Khazad-dûm. Gimli wasn't born until 2879, I think. So we're talking a good 800-900 years later. And the dwarves had been kicked out from Khazad-dûm. They go up into the Grey Mountains. They get kicked out of there by a dragon. They go to Erebor. They get kicked out of there by Smaug. Then they go and hide themselves back in the Blue Mountains, which seemed the safest place at the time, and that's where Gimli arrives. So Gimli, although he saw Moria, obviously when he was an adult, he had no memory of it. He just had this memory, this story of its greatness. And so one of the things, I think it was well delivered as well. In the films is that, and they call it a mine. This is the feel that he's got. He is so certain about how amazing Moria is, and also has faith in his family to have restored it to his further glory, its past glory. So he missed it in the past. He grew up in exile. He grew up with the stories, which I think for the dwarves actually probably meant just as much. You get people like Balin, who went off and tried to recover it, and he similarly, this was just like he was child when that happened. The idea of the lost homeland is very, very central to the dwarven identity. Therese Barrett saying, long time watcher, first time catching you live. Well, welcome. Great to see you. How did elves other than Galadriel and Legolas react to Gimli sailing west? The short answer is we don't know. Tolkien doesn't tell us. It's just, in fact, it's just a legend that we have that Gimli and Legolas sailed west. I think the fact is that we should probably interpret this as being, yes, it's exclusionary to others, but the idea of you cannot travel to the Undying Lands unless you're an elf. But it's, I think, when it comes to those who were involved in these great quests, the ring bearers in particular, there's a leeway given. There's a love, there's a grace given there. So I think it's worth pointing out he probably only got as far as Tol Eressëa anyway. But I think that it's worth pointing out that when you go there, that is not that suddenly you become undying. If you go to the Undying Lands, you do not become undying. It is the land itself that is undying. It is the land itself that is immortal. So it can heal and it can preserve, but if you are mortal, then you will You will die. And so this is Gimli when he was very old, when he was nearly going to die anyway, just going there to see it, to see Galadriel with his last dying days, years, whatever it was. So that's the kind of feel we have. And I suspect that the other elves, I don't know because we're not told, but I suspect the other elves would have the same kind of magnanimity that we seem to see when the ring bearers board that boat at the end of the White Ship, at the end of the Lord of the Rings. Technically, should Bilbo and Frodo have been going to the Undying Lands, that's not their place, but they are welcomed. They are given this as an honor. They're given this as a chance for them to find peace. So I think that we should see this as a matter of grace. And when the oldest and the wisest elves allow this, then I think the others probably would too. Martin S. saying, elves don't like dwarves all that much, which you have touched upon. I have. Does that mean Aula is one of the least liked among the Valar to the elves? Not really. I mean, when we're not told that the elves didn't like Aula, there is within this creation myth of the dwarves, which I won't go into huge amounts of detail, but there is definitely an element of concern there that the dwarves amongst some, like Yavanna, who is another one of this pantheon of deities, that the dwarves would be destroying the environment, to put it in a slightly blunter way than Tolkien did. They would be chopping down trees and things like that. And this is part of what prompted the creation of the Ents. Now, does that mean that the elves didn't like Aula? No, not at all. In fact, we get some elves like Feanor who studied under him, who loved creating, and we see that through Celebrimbor, who is a descendant of Feanor. They loved making things. They loved smithing things. That's something that's slightly lost when we look at the Peter Jackson, in particular, the Peter Jackson style elves, who are very ethereal. It feels like we're looking at the latter days of the elven world, which is true. Pardon me. But at their height, elves loved creating, and subcreation as an issue which is very, very close to Tolkien's heart. This idea that you are created and you have that creative spark within you, and then you create. And that is something that the elves definitely had. So no, they did not dislike Aula, but perhaps they weren't always getting on the best with all of Aula's creations. Kelly Summers saying, I'd like to think that Gimli met Aula for both of them. Yeah, I mean, that would be good. We don't have any evidence of that, but I do. That's a really nice thought. Reflective rambling, picking up a question from Minty Scales. Thank you very much. I love it when people do this. Saying, do you think Gimli understood the significance of Galadriel giving him her hair? Did anyone else in the Fellowship understand her and Feanor link? Okay, well, let me get into this. I have a question. Let me see whether I can find the question. Johnny Seriani was asking, this is over on Patreon, can you tell us about the significance of Galadriel's gift to Gimli when leaving Lothlorien? And I think Maura Lee, you also asked about this. So let's get into this gift. So the backstory, before we get on to Gimli, let's get into the Galadriel backstory. When Galadriel was much younger, and this is before the elves had come back to Middle-earth, she she still did have much later. Beautiful hair, amazing hair. It was like the kind of hair everyone looked at and was just wow. And it was said that her hair captured the light of the two trees of Valinor. These two trees are an incredibly important and central part of Elven, well, not just Elven, about the entire world. They were the source of light for the entire world. And it was a holy light. It was a blessing light. And it was said that her hair captured that light. Feanor, who is this astonishing character, the most powerful, the greatest and most powerful of the Noldor elves, and a great smith, he was fascinated by this. He went on to create the Silmarils, the three great jewels that were so important in Elven history that we get the Silmarillion is named after them. But his fascination started with Galadriel's hair, because the Silmarils captured that light from the trees in the same way that Galadriel's hair was said to have captured that light. And he asked her, he said, "Can I have 3 strands of your hair?" He made 3 Silmarils later, and she said no. And he asked her again, and she said no. She always had this uncertainty. He does come across as a bit creepy in this, it has to be said, but also she could see a bit more into his heart perhaps than others could. She was denying this. Fast forward a long time to Gimli, and she says, "Gimli, what do you want to ask for?" And remember, Galadriel can read people's minds and hearts. She knows what he wants. He wants some of her hair to take away. He's as blinded by this as Feanor was. But Gimli goes, I'm not going to ask for anything. I'm not going to ask you for anything at all. I do not want to ask for anything. And she says, "Okay, don't ask, but what would you like?" And when he says it, he asks for 1, she gives him 3, which is a deliberate echo. This is one of the astonishing things with Tolkien, is that it's an echo of something that the people, when they were reading that book, when it was first published, they will have had no real idea, because he hadn't published the Silmarillion. He never published the Silmarillion in his lifetime. He'd written about it, but he'd done this echo of something which was an echo of something in his own world that the reader would perhaps never have known. Later, we understood it. And she gives him these hairs because he didn't ask for it, because his heart was so much nobler than Feanor's. This is a really important and symbolic thing. And this acted as, to go back to the kind of the Arthurian feel, where the knight who is the champion for a fair maiden would have a favor from them, something that they would give him that he would carry around with pride, knowing that this was a gift from her. So that is what is going on there. It's multi-layered, and that gave him strength and heart and purpose. So the question, sorry, that was a very long way around, but the question from Minty Scales: did anyone else in the fellowship understand about that? And I think the short answer is most, almost certainly not. Legolas may well have done. Aragorn probably would have done. But the others, no, they wouldn't have had the foggiest idea what was going on there. Martin S. Asking the same question. So I hope well, I gave a long answer to that, so hopefully that's picked up on both of those. Rico de Vries saying, "Hello, Robert. I don't know if you already said this. I just came home from work. I wonder, do we know who the mother of Gimli is? Love all of your work." Thank you very much. No, we don't. Tolkien names very few female dwarves, and this is probably, I mean, if we're going in-world, this is probably because the female dwarves, first of all, there are fewer of them than male dwarves, and secondly, they very rarely sort of come above ground. They don't mix or circulate as much as male dwarves do. So no, we don't know who his mother is. Let's go to question from let's see where we got up to. Richard Galloway saying, "Hi, Robert. I've always wondered, Gimli, hi there. Gimli supposedly was allowed to sail to Valinor with Legolas due to the strength of their friendship. I can't help but wonder what would be the point. I'm sure it would be lovely in the Blessed Realm and such, but he had no great healing needed. He'd be like a moth near a flame. What benefit would he receive besides being with Legolas? Dwarves value family connections, so abandoning everything just to go across the sea to die strikes me as a bit of an odd decision." Well, yeah, it is. And he's, I mean, one day I might make a video on this, because quite how astonishing this is, I think we don't really get. Because when mortals go across there, we're told, they die. It's terrible. It is death for them. They're cursed. We get what is spelled out quite clearly, that the ring bearers gets this kind of special dispensation. So Bilbo, and then Frodo, and then Sam, because Sam was also a ring bearer for a time. They seem to get this special dispensation that they can head over at the end of their lives, or for Frodo, it's not quite the end of his life, but he has a lot of healing to do. But Gimli wasn't a ring bearer. Gimli is an exception. He is and he's a dwarf. He's the only dwarf we hear of who goes across there. There's clearly something very, very special going on there. So what's it all about? I mean, I think the first thing is to show that he is a mold breaker for dwarves. That's the whole idea, is that he's, as I was saying earlier, Tolkien created this trope of what a dwarf is like, and then immediately shows us this character who breaks all of the tropes. Gimli is different to everyone else. Gimli is a very... he is an exception, but it's worth, I think, making the distinction. This isn't just because he's friends with Legolas. Yes, that is the way that Legolas got the boat and they went across. That is that. But the implication, I think, is that this was for Galadriel, and this was almost like a reward at the end for him being this champion. So again, think of this idealized Arthurian champion. And if you go down this route, you go, well, does that mean that he, like an idealized Galahad, would stay pure throughout all of this, being the champion of Galadriel? And by pure, in a very simplistic way, perhaps he never married, perhaps he didn't have children, perhaps he was the last of his line. So when you're asking there, Richard, about family being very important for the dwarves, well, yes, but perhaps he then had no family. Perhaps that's the feel that we have. Hobbits also very family focused. When Sam, Merry, and Pippin all left the Shire shortly before their deaths, when they were very old, and each of them, they did have families, but it was like when their families were grown up, when their wives had died, when the moment was right. I don't think that Gimli would have left a family who were reliant on him behind. I think that the idea that we're supposed to have in our head is that he's this pure champion of Galadriel right to the end, and then he gets his reward in the same way Legolas gets his reward, he gets to see the world, but he gets to not return for him, but he gets to go to Valinor. Gimli gets his reward at the end as well. So that's what happens with the Fellowship that stay true. Gandalf gets his reward. Merry and Pippin, they get to journey back to Rohan and then on to Gondor. They're buried next to the king. Sam gets to head off to Valinor to go and presumably see Frodo for that last time. They get their rewards, and this is Gimli's reward. Martin S. saying, I think Tolkien's story has a theme of the greatest and mightiest not always being the best personality-wise. Fëanor was undoubtedly greater than Gimli, but flawed, and hobbits aren't mighty. Yes, absolutely. And though we're not doing a study this time on Galadriel, it's worth noting how she was considered after Fëanor had gone the greatest of the elves, but although she obviously turned out good, when she started out, the word that Tolkien used about her more than anything else was pride. She was proud. She was willful. She wanted to rule. She had a lust for power. This was not actually, to start with, a character that we would particularly sympathize with. Her character arc ends with her being the person that we know of as Galadriel there in The Lord of the Rings, which shows us, and then she gets this final personal struggle against the temptation of the One Ring to show that she has come all the way through. Yes, absolutely. Being powerful is not necessarily seen as a great thing unless it's also paired with humility, which is where Gandalf also obviously fits in with this, and to a degree also Aragorn. Cull Carsnot just giving us a little bit of extra knowledge here, saying the word Galahad, Percival, which is, I used this just a moment or so ago as this Arthurian idea of this idealized perfect. He's not always perfect in all of the Arthurian legends, but in certainly some of them he's idealized as this great champion knight. He's derived from the Galley priests of Galilee, home of Jesus. The cult of Cybele used eunuch priests who remained chaste, which Jesus encouraged. Matthew 19:12. Feel free to look that one up. Good knowledge there. Thank you very much. Rika de Vries saying, if I subscribe to Patreon, does Robert take all the questions from there every stream, or does he select some questions? I guess there are a lot of questions for every stream. I try to take. I try to answer all of them. Obviously, sometimes I can't take all of them, so I will. If I try my very best to answer at least one question from every patron. So if you're a patron I'm doing a live stream, I will try my very best to answer at least one of your questions, hopefully more. Question from Dorothy Techno saying, G'day, Robert. G'day. First time joining in with your brilliant content. Well, thank you very much and welcome. I don't know if it's alluded to in the books and I've missed it, but why did Gimli show no interest in traditional dwarf traits around hoarding and a greed of gold, especially when being in close proximity to the One Ring? He showed no desire to take it for himself. I watch all your content and it's always a highlight of my week. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you very much. So, first of all, I think we shouldn't misunderstand the dwarven attitude to things like gold. This is the quote we have about dwarves, is that dwarves' hearts are, so says Tolkien, hard to tame, and the thoughts of their hearts are hidden. So this is they're supposed to be a mystery, and they're supposed to be difficult to pin down. Dwarves are not just about gold. Now, it's very noticeable that you when you get the Hobbit, and the dwarves in the Hobbit are a lot more stereotyped, I would say, in the way that Tolkien presents them. But even there, you get someone like Thorin is viewed as being a bit of an outlier in terms of his kind of lust for gold. The other dwarves, yeah, they want it, but it's more about regaining their homeland. That's the real driver for them. And so Gimli, we should not be surprised if he's not there immediately just trying to get as much gold and sparkly things as he possibly can all the time. That's genuinely not what dwarves are like. They care about their homeland. They care about crafting things as much as actually gold and the like. Do we see it? We do a bit. We definitely do. He certainly takes a huge pride in Moria, in Khazad-dûm as they're passing through it. And we get to see with the glittering caves, he is blown away by them, and that's the thing which draws him back. He's got a world to save, but the moment that has finished, he's heading back there. Do not worry about that. So that is the kind of feel we have. As for the lure of the ring, yes, he's close to it for quite some time. Tolkien shows us the one person, being Boromir, who is turned by the power of the ring, and that's almost as if the ring is hunting out who's the weak one here, who's the one who actually has a purpose and a need and for that ring, for that power at that moment in time. And so it focuses on Boromir because Boromir, for the best of reasons, it has to be said, for the best of reasons, Boromir wishes to protect his homeland. And he thinks that the best way to do that is by using every advantage that they could possibly lay their hands on. And if this thing here would make them more powerful, of course they should be using that. So that's how it wheedles its way into Boromir. With Gimli, what does Gimli want? Well, as a dwarf, he has a natural resistance, it would appear, to some sort of ring magic, but he wants to go find a cave and then dig for gold and for great things, and that is it. And it is beyond our human understanding for quite how that works, but it isn't about power in the way that we see it. Buck1 Andy saying, thanks for making Thursday afternoons at work substantially more entertaining. Well, you're very welcome. Let's go to a question from Maura Lee. Saying, one of my favourite scenes in The Fellowship of the Ring, both the movies and the books, was during the Council of Elrond when the Fellowship of the Ring formed around Frodo to be there to protect him on his journey. I loved it when Gimli in the movie said, "and my axe," or something to that effect. What do you think was Tolkien's rationale to include different representations from the many races of Middle-earth in order to make up the Fellowship? Was it solely due to everyone having a stake in the outcome of what happens during the war with Sauron, or was there something more to this, something deeper? Well, I think the deeper thing is that he is showing us Elrond's understanding of who should be on that mission. And it has to be a small number of people. It has to be people who... it's worth saying that he only charges Frodo with the destruction of the ring. The rest he just charges with going with Frodo as far as they wish to. And while they do that, protect him. But beyond that, there's no charge on them at all. So, and this is how Boromir is there, because nobody thinks Boromir is going all the way into Mordor. He's made it very clear that's not what he thinks is right. But he's going part of the way, and he might as well stick around. And so he joins the Fellowship. Gimli and Legolas are indeed there to be representing dwarves and elves, and it does seem that Elrond has this concept of wanting there to be something symbolic about this group. One of which is the 9 against 9. This is a Gandalf thing as well. There are 9 Black Riders. There should be 9 members of the Fellowship. Also, this idea of this representing the free peoples of the world. Elrond, I've just been making actually a short form video about this very subject. For those who are interested, I'm now on TikTok, by the way, in case anyone's interested. Really enjoying making just short videos. They're also on this channel. I'm starting to upload on this channel as well, so wherever you want to get them. But I've been making a video about Elrond. The way Tolkien uses him and his heritage is absolutely fascinating, because he's not just an elf. He's not even Elrond the half-elven. He is a representative, figuratively, of the free peoples of Middle-earth, because he is actually descended from all 3 of the original tribes of the elves, and he's descended from the 3 houses of the Edain, human houses who are faithful, and he's also descended from Mellon the Maiar. He is there as a representation of the people of Middle-earth. His father is literally driving the star across the sky, which is the star Gil-Estel, the star of high hope. He is being on Earth the representation of that hope for the peoples of Middle-earth. And so from him and that kind of symbolism, it makes sense that the Fellowship should be representing all the peoples of Middle-earth. What was Tolkien doing with that? Was it just to get a dwarf? I'm sure having a dwarf there would be a good thing, but to get buy-in from the dwarves, figuratively, I think was even more important. Martin S. saying, was Gimli in the Blue Mountains when his father Glóin went with Thorin, Gandalf, Bilbo, etc. to Erebor? What did Father Glóin tell him of that trip? Well, yes, he was there. He was 62, a young dwarf, left behind because he was considered too young to come along. So he will have known about it. He wanted to go along, so he knew what the mission was. He knew what the plan, such as it was. He wanted to go along, but was not allowed. What will have been told afterwards? Well, the story was well known. By the time he made his way across to Erebor afterwards, which will have been quite some time later, it has to be said, because the news will have had to travel all the way from the Lonely Mountain over to the Blue Mountains, and then they would have had to travel all the way from the Blue Mountains over to Erebor. It would have been some time, but the story will have been well known by then. So, will Glóin have told him any specifics? I'm sure he will have done, but they will all have known the story about what happened. Reflective rambling in the chat saying, I know Tolkien hates allegory, but also is there a subconscious nod here to the different people and classes that were brought together during the Great War, World War One? People of different views and types forced to be brothers. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an element of that. He's definitely said how Sam in particular is a nod to a lot of the sort of the British. This means a different thing in our modern world, but Batmen that were there in the trenches of World War One, and how he basically said they were the best of us. They were better than us. They're us in this instance being the educated upper classes. Tolkien was more like a Frodo than he was a Sam himself. Let's go to a question from Alison, which is linked to this, saying, I was wondering what you think Gimli's motivation was for joining the Fellowship. I'm a bit perplexed by both his and Legolas's motivations. I also find it interesting that the two characters whose motives elude me become the best of friends. Comments, please. Well, the first thing to say is that we're not told specific motivations for Gimli or Legolas. We're just told that, in fact, the Council of Elrond that we're presented with in the films is an incredibly squished, cut down version of what we have in the books. In the books, it's quite a drawn out affair for like some poems and songs, have a feast here or there. And when they finally do come to a decision about what to do, really, it's only Frodo and Sam who are going to be heading off. The clear implication is Gandalf is going with them. But who else is joining this group? That's left for a while, where Elrond sends out some scouts to go and see what's going on in the world. He sends them. Where's Radagast got to? What's going on with him? What's happening in Mirkwood? What's happening with where did the Black Riders go? Is Sauron moving again? He sent his scouts out to try and figure out what's going on. And during that pause, that was when he then came up with this idea of who's going to be going. Now, I can assume, reading between the lines, we're not told this exactly, that he went to the dwarves who were there, this dwarf contingent, and said, it would be really good if a dwarf goes along on this. And Glóin, who was leading that contingent, would have said something like, well, I would, but I'm getting a bit old. How about my son? He couldn't go on the quest of Erebor because he was too young then, but now, full figure of a man, full figure of a dwarf. He's the person for it. And Gimli, I'm sure, would have accepted because he was asked. What was he intending to do at the time? What was his motivation? I think we can probably put it down to, as well as that, because he was asked to do it, quite pure motivations. He'd just been told that the worlds are going to end if we don't destroy this ring, and was then asked to be a part of destroying the ring. So I think that there's no reason to doubt anything other than pure motivations on that. It's a bit muddled for everyone, it has to be said. Boromir joins the Fellowship. He's got his own motivations for doing that. We get Merry and Pippin, who want to go along partly because they care about Frodo and they want to be there and support him and be with him, which is a fantastic motivation to be there. But I think for Gimli and for Legolas as well, we can basically just say they saw the need and they were there, and so that's why they joined up. Well, I'm just about halfway through, actually. Just very quickly, what I always like to do about halfway through is do a few quick thank yous. If you are enjoying the live stream, if you're in the chat and enjoying the chat, then please do show a little bit of love to the moderators who do a fantastic job here. They are the people you can see in the chat with the spammers who are keeping the chat a safe and happy place for everyone. Also, I would like to say thank you to my patrons who support the work of this channel, of Deep Geek more broadly. And if you would like to support this channel, there's a link down either in the description, or if you're watching live, I'm sure one of the moderators will drop it into there. So with that said, let's get back to a question from Dioxer saying, Guten evening, Herr Robert. Guten Abend to you. One opinion I heard often was that the portrayal of Gimli in the movies was that of comic relief, and it didn't fit the Gimli from the books, where his role was more that of the great warrior. Somewhat like 30 years have gone by since I've read the books, so I'm not really sure. But I think his character feels fitting in the movies, and I think the Fellowship needed someone who knows how to laugh, pardon me, in dire situations. Do you think he was treated badly by Peter Jackson? I do think he was treated. His character was treated badly by Peter Jackson, and I say that without wishing to slight the films in any way. I mean, I'm not alone in this thought, but I think that they are the height of what cinema can be. I think they're fantastic films, and I completely understand from an artistic perspective why they made that decision, and it was a very clear decision. That there is a big difference between Gimli's generally quite stoic persona in the books and his comic relief. And it's not so much comic relief because he's being the funny person telling jokes. It's the comic relief with he is the butt of jokes. Jokes about his height, jokes about how he eats, jokes about how fast he can run, things like that. And I understand why, because without some comic relief, they would be quite particularly the first couple, the third will perhaps forgive it for being quite dark, but the first couple of films would have been a lot darker in tone, and I think that he wanted to ensure that it remained a lot lighter. We start off with the Hobbits, and Merry and Pippin are very much comic relief, but then when they're not on the screen, where's it going to come from? He chooses Gimli. So what that means is that I think an entire generation of Tolkien fans have in their minds this idea of what dwarf culture is, which is spilling beer down their beard, burping, being very easily offended, saying things like "never toss a dwarf" and things like that kind of thing. That's not what Tolkien wanted. He always presented dwarves as being noble, different but noble, and so yes, he was done a disservice. Now, for me, I know that many book fans would point at the portrayals, say, of Faramir in particular as being something they would point at and go, that character has been hugely changed, and that character was hugely changed. But for me, one of the bits that I dislike the most is the way that they changed Gimli's character, and that's because you could change Faramir's character, but that there are plenty of other Gondorians, there are plenty of other characters who are humans who can give us a much rounder view. But Peter Jackson emphasized quite a lot that this is Dwarven. We're seeing Dwarven culture because John Rhys Davies is so good at presenting Gimli as a dwarf, and that I think gave the wrong impression to a lot of people about what Dwarven culture was like. Let's go to sorry, just in the chat, actually, you've got getting a few responses in this one. Lucian saying, I still really like the on-screen portrayal of Gimli. Yeah, as I said, don't get me wrong. I think I completely understand why they did it, and I laughed along with everybody else at all of the Gimli jokes. I just think if you take a step back, if you're going to put on your nerd hat, then there are a few concerns I would have with that. Let's go to a question from Callie Summers. When the Fellowship split up, why didn't Gimli go after Frodo and Sam? He was a great fighter, but his presence wasn't game-changing at Helm's Deep, the Paths of the Dead, Pelennor Fields, or the Morannon. The friendship with Legolas was great for the reader, but Gimli would have been an excellent aid to the hobbits. Wouldn't have drawn much attention as Legolas, and he probably could have thrown the ring in himself with great difficulty, of course. Well, yeah, this is one of those things where it's a sort of a world of what if Gimli had gone along with them. I did a video which surprised me how much interest there was in this. It was just a throwaway thought of mine. Why not give the ring to Gimli? How well would he have done? And I think one of the things I said in there, I'm not going to spoil the whole video. One of the things I said in there, though, was that we have to say that the risk was greater with Gimli, because you give it to Sam. What's his vision? His vision is to become the world's greatest gardener. That's what power means to Sam. Gimli was a guy who could face an entire army down and kill them on his own. He was a machine. And if you gave him the One Ring, suddenly that would be an immense figure of power. So there was a big risk there. But put that to one side. What happened when you read that again? You get there's three of them who are left. So Gandalf has gone, Boromir has gone, two hobbits went one way, two hobbits went the other way. Who are they going to follow? Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. And basically, Gimli and Legolas accept the lead of Aragorn. And so that's ultimately why Gimli didn't go. Could they have split themselves up? They could have done, but this is one of those kind of Tolkien moments of insight, I think, from Aragorn, where basically Aragorn's going, I mean, now we were going to split up at this point anyway. Perhaps this is the way it's supposed to go. Perhaps they should be heading off on their own. And we swore to protect the hobbits. There are some over here that we can go and protect. Let's go that way. And Gimli and Legolas go along with Aragorn. So could he have? He could have done. Would he have been a good companion for them? Well, I'm sure at some points he would. He wouldn't have been as good at sneaking as the dwarves were. So whether he would have been help or hindrance, we do not know. We also do not know how well he would have managed to resist the ring when it got into Mordor itself. We're told very clearly that the closer they got to Mount Doom, the stronger the pull of the ring was, to the point where when Frodo was stood there right by the cracks of Doom, that's when he fell. He could get himself up there, that last bit himself, but that was when it was strongest. Could Gimli have overcome? I think the implication is that even Gimli would not have been able to get rid of it at the end. Andrew K saying, not you, me, but some that judge Peter Jackson too harshly have to consider the fantasy and cinematic climate at the time. If the films were made now, certain aspects would have been handled differently, in my opinion. Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I find it really hard to be harsh on Peter Jackson and the people who made those films, because they made lots of changes that individually I didn't like, but that turned into something which was greater than the sum of its parts. So I've got to respect everything that they achieved with that. Martin S. Could dwarves have been part of forging the rings of power, being influenced by Anatar instead of the elves? Or did it have to be the elves, which seems to be the spiritually greatest non-Ainuric race? So could Sauron, way back in the Second Age, when he was doing his cunning plan to forge the rings of power, could he have gone to the dwarves first rather than the elves? Well, theoretically, yes. However, I think we have to remember, if we forget the Rings of Power, the TV show, the way this went down in the books is that Sauron knew who he thought his enemies were. to start with, this was very clearly the elves. That was who his enemies were. So his cunning plan was to infiltrate the elves, get them to make these rings, put on the rings, and then he could control the elves. That was the idea. It was only later, when he got rumbled, that he gathered together the rings of power that he could, and then distributed them to other races. So could he have got the dwarves to do it? Well, yes, but he wasn't really that bothered by the dwarves, to be honest. He wanted to take over Middle-earth for long and complicated reasons. He could ignore, for the most part, he could ignore the dwarves. As long as he stayed above ground, that was it. The dwarves did get involved in the War of the Elves and Sauron, which was just after the forging of the Rings of Power, but he managed to push them back to Khazad-dûm. Then they locked the gates and weren't seen from again for hundreds of years. So I think he had every reason not to be that concerned about the dwarves. It was the elves he was after. Seek and Destroy 99 saying, have you thought about doing character studies on the main players in House of the Dragon, like Cregan Stark, Boris Baratheon, Torrhen Manderly, etc.? Yes, I think when we come to House of the Dragon Season 2, I will definitely be getting back more into looking at House of the Dragon characters. How many of them we will see in the coming season, we'll have to wait and see on that one. But yeah, I will be doing more. As for when that will be, they are filming now. They have started filming. They're now they're in Spain, I think, at the moment, doing filming in King's Landing. They're not at the moment. I know a lot of people have been concerned about the writer's strike and the impact. There's lots of issues there to go educate yourself if you wish about the reasons for the writer's strike, but purely in terms of the knock-on effects for TV productions, then it seems to be that House of the Dragon is just charging on ahead. They are very confident in the scripts that they've got. They don't need to be rewritten, and I suspect somewhere in the back of their brains they're thinking, well, if the writer's strike lasts anything less than 10 months, then at the end of their schedule they can just do a few reshoots of some things that need rewriting. So we shouldn't get a delay on House of the Dragon Season 2. Season 3, definitely. House of the Dragon Season 2, no. I'm still expecting that summer, maybe autumn of next year. But yes, I'll be doing more on that, and I'll be doing a few things leading up to it as well. Question from 444 saying, hi Robert, after reading The Hobbit, where there was a band of dwarves and one hobbit, I was expecting to find out more about the dwarves in Lord of the Rings, but there it was all reversed. A band of hobbits and one dwarf. Why did Tolkien choose that? Has Peter Jackson explained why Gimli character was chosen as comic relief? I couldn't hear the same vibe in the Lord of the Rings narration. Well, and that second bit I think I covered actually just in the previous question. I don't know if he's actually come out and specifically talked about all of his reasoning, but yes, it was clearly a difference. In terms of why didn't we get more about dwarves in the Lord of the Rings, I think we have to look at this from Tolkien's perspective himself, which is we view this as we get The Hobbit and then we get the Lord of the Rings as being like a sequel. And those are his two great masterpieces. And he wrote some other background stuff. That's not how Tolkien really viewed this. The Legendarium, the world of Middle-earth, was his life's work. And out from that popped a couple of stories. and the stories that we get that he completed were The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So it's not as if he was trying to give a full rounded view of what's going on in those two stories. Those two stories are there just as offshoots of the bigger narrative arc of what we've got going on. We find more about the dwarves in the Silmarillion, which obviously wasn't published in his lifetime. There's a condensed version, effectively a condensed version of it is the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. But yeah, he wasn't there trying to teach us more about this world there. He was trying to tell a story. King of Imps saying, "Hey, Robert, hello. We're told in the appendices that the people of Durin flourished in the Fourth Age and that Gimli became the Lord of Aglarond under Helm's Deep. How many dwarves could have lived at the colony, and would it have lasted well into the Fourth Age?" So yeah, these are the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep, going into the mountains there. How many dwarves? Depends how big they made the caverns. The idea is that the dwarves work with nature. So they're not just sort of like carving out a bit here, carving out a bit there. We're not told all of the depth of this, but they are big and they are magnificent. And the dwarves could easily chisel out new living quarters over here. They could keep going. There's a whole mountain range that they're backing onto. So the number has no limit as to how many could be there. Could they have carried on into the Fourth Age? The clear implication is that not only could they, but they did. Gimli led them in the Fourth Age, and then he headed off. And the implication is that that community grew and survived and thrived, but were getting more and more insular over time until the humans above ground reached a point of just dwarves becoming legends. This is our own world. We have to remember this. Tolkien sort of plays with this idea, but this is our own world he's talking about. So where we are now, and we have legends of all of these old things, dwarves and elves and the like, it's because back then they were real, but now they've just sort of descended into the mists of time. The way that he described it, though, was in a different stage of imagination to the world we have right now. So it's not like it's this is 5,000 years ago or 7,000 years ago or whatever. It's in a different stage of imagination. So it's shifted on to somewhere new, but we still retain the echo of the memory of those times. Martin S. asking, would dwarves like Gimli have been told about Aula when growing up, like people growing up in the real world West are told about Christian figures like, say, Jesus Christ and his mother, the Virgin Mary? Yeah, absolutely. So this is about who the dwarves are. This is very much part of their culture. Their creator is Aula. So yes, they will know about this in the same way that the elves will talk about their time back in Valinor and the members of the Valar there. Let's go to a question from Creative Branches. I saw a redesign of the mythological dwarf that didn't follow Tolkien's traits and themes. They ended up much like grubs and kept the tough, short, practical body shape. If you were to redesign dwarves and take them in a new direction from Tolkien, what would they look like and what other traits might they have? I found this I was thinking about this earlier. I found this a really hard one because I think that the way that dwarves have been portrayed is not exactly how Tolkien himself portrayed them. So whereas you get, if you sort of move on to the D&D and things like that, we get elves very clear, halflings very clear. We know what they are like, so perhaps we could do a little twist on that. I think with dwarves, we often get in our kind of generic fantasy understanding this very kind of taciturn dwarf, and Gimli is not that. He does laugh, incidentally. He's one of the few members of the Fellowship who clearly openly laughs when they discover that this was Gandalf, who is in Fangorn. This isn't Saruman. Gimli laughs. So he has got this kind of, and that's quite a self-deprecatory sense of humor as well. So he is, he's not always dur. There is a dignity to dwarves. So I think I would say the one thing I would want to keep wherever you went with this is this sense of dignity that perhaps we've lost a bit when we're talking about dwarves. When Akatosh Ray saying, when Gimli was leading the dwarves, what were his tax policies? Great question. I will have to give that one a little bit of thought. He doesn't. What do we know? Well, we can say firstly they were very generous in giving gifts to other nations in establishing good relationships with others. You get the gates of Minas Tirith, which were incredibly impressive and powerful in their day, had been destroyed by Grond during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Gimli and co. redid them with Mithril. So this shows a huge amount of generosity on his part. In terms of how the dwarves operated, we don't really, they seem to be more of a community than having a tax system per se. But I'll have a think about it, and if something comes to me, I will make a video of it. Let's go to a question from Callie Summers, saying, shout out to you and all the mods for an always awesome stream and chat experience. I was rewatching your character study on Gimli, and you highlighted his resistance to the ring. I think it's slightly less than tinfoil to ask if you think the resistance of dwarves in general to the rings of power might have to do with their connection to Aula, and thus have some innate understanding of how Sauron created the rings. In Tolkien's world, deep knowledge can be literal power. I think it's a really interesting thought. My take is that the knowledge, the connection to Aula and the knowledge does not necessarily provide a protection for them. This is evidenced, I think, by the fact that the three people outside of the dwarves who are most connected with Aula are Sauron, Saruman, and Feanor. And all three of them had a bit of, they fell to the lust for power, particularly obviously Sauron did. He was a long way down that path already, of course. Saruman did when he learned more about the rings. He started trying to learn more about the rings in order to understand how to oppose the One Ring, and he just got more and more knowledge, and that turned into him learning more about it because he wanted it. He wanted to understand it, and he wanted the power over it. So having that knowledge more often than not can lead to power hungriness, which isn't to say Tolkien saw knowledge as a bad thing in and of itself. It's a matter of what's going on in your heart. So, no, I don't think that the dwarf resistance to the rings was anything to do, specifically to do with their relationship with Aula. I think it's that they were different and the desires of their heart were different. So, it's very clear that the ring plays into what your own weakness is. What kind of power or strength do you want? I use the Sam example a lot with them, him being this great gardener, and he would use it for good. Boromir is there wanting to protect his people. Everybody who gets tempted by the ring uses its power for their own purposes. Bilbo just seems to want to keep hold of it and use it as a power to get himself out of awkward social situations, which is absolutely fine. That says a huge amount about who he is as a character. It's one day somebody's going to write an essay about this, but it is very noticeable that he, right from the beginning, he doesn't like, he's an introvert. I mean, he enjoys spending time with people, but he likes being on his own. He doesn't like having these gate crashes. He particularly doesn't like having the Sackville Bagginses around. We get Mary once sees him seeing somebody come towards him. That might have been the Sackville Bagginses, and he just hid behind a hedge and put the ring on because he just didn't want somebody to be disturbing him on that lovely day. This is a fascinating object study of what Bilbo was actually tempted with by the ring. He was tempted with just being free to be himself, getting out of these awkward situations. Similarly, Gollum, what was he tempted with? Just being on his own and having the things in his own small pocket of the world that he wanted. As much fish as he could eat, the occasional goblin that he could club to death. That was the limit of it. Dwarves, what is it that they desire more than anything else? They desire to delve deeper and to discover more and to craft more. And that would have been what was the temptation for Gimli. So the issue is actually that Sauron found it hard to understand other people's hearts. He could only understand his own desires, and he thought that, this is classic psychological projection, he thought that everybody would be like that. And some people were like that. Some people did have that lust for power within them. He chose well when he chose the 9 mortals who would become the ring wraiths. But with the dwarf lords, no, he completely misjudged and misunderstood what temptation they would have. Let's go to a question from Maura Lee. I've got 3 more questions from my patrons. So now is a good time to drop any more Gimli-related questions into the chat. After that, I will open it up for wider questions. Maura Lee saying, in the history of Middle-earth, there was always an enmity between the races of dwarves and elves. However, by the end of the trilogy, Gimli and Legolas were able to get past this and become great friends. What message, if any, was Tolkien trying to share with his readers about this relationship that slowly developed between the two? Well, I mean, I think we can sometimes overanalyze these things. My take is quite a simple one, which is one of the key messages. Tolkien didn't like the idea of giving messages, but one of the key themes which comes through all of this is friendship. The friendship between Sam and Frodo, and Merry and Pippin to Frodo as well. And this isn't just them, the hobbits. He showed other friendships developing. And so what I think he wanted to show was also perhaps a degree of hope, that even for him, as much as anything else, because the reader will not have known all of that back when they were first reading it. They will not have known all of that backstory about why dwarves and elves didn't like each other. Don't mean there were like hints of it in the Lord of the Rings. Oh yes, but this happened all that time ago. But this was important for Tolkien at the very end, that we can get the elves and the dwarves back on friendly terms. So friendship and hope, and sometimes we can overanalyze, I think, and try and come up with more, but that, I think, fundamentally is where we're at. Charis Ballerina, how do you rate Gimli among the known dwarves? Better than the Durins? Also, was that Radagast he saw in the Two Towers, Gandalf trolling them? So in the Two Towers that we're talking about in Fangorn Forest, that was Gandalf. It was, well, first of all, they probably did see Saruman, but they did also see Gandalf. But Gandalf at the time did not know he was Gandalf. He had returned, and he did not know his name. He was, when they sort of put it to him, we thought you were Saruman, and he basically said, well, yeah, kind of I am, but like Saruman as he ought to have been. So, yes, that's what it was. Not Radagast, no. Radagast basically went off into hiding, not to be seen from again. But how do I rate Gimli among the known dwarves? Better than the Durins? Well, how do I rate him? I don't know. He's a dwarf I like, probably the dwarf I like the most. He's the dwarf we get to know the most about. So in terms of what he achieved, great things. He has to be right up there. He founded a new dwarf realm. It wasn't that. So for a lot of the Third Age, the dwarves were being run out of their previous homes and then were trying to reclaim those homes, which is great. But Gimli founded effectively an entirely new dwarf nation. So he will have gone down in dwarf history as one of the absolute greats. I have no doubt about that at all. Callie Summers, in the world of the books, would Gimli actually lose a drinking contest to Legolas? It feels like Peter Jackson just likes elves more than dwarves. I'd have bet on Gimli. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Peter Jackson had a very high view of elves and perhaps a lower view of dwarves. In terms of a drinking competition, instinctively you've got to say Gimli, but the elves of Northern Mirkwood did drink a lot. These are the elves, let's not forget, which is where Legolas came from. These are the elves that Bilbo came across when he was doing that barrel escape with all the dwarves, and they were drinking wine seemingly almost every night, having feasts. So they will have certainly built up quite a tolerance. So if I'm to try and hedge my bets on this, I think it would be, depending on what they're drinking, the Legolas probably would be much more used to drinking wine. Gimli probably would be much more used to drinking beer. And actually, that's it. I'd already picked up this question. The last question I had from my patrons was the one about Galadriel's gift. Let's go into the chat and have a quick flick through. Ava Gibson saying, can't stay, but thank you so much for the content later. Thank you very much. And Kaziglu Bay also heading off for a nap. Mark Sheesa saying, we know from The Hobbit that elves can get drunk. They definitely do get drunk there. Reflective Rambling saying, can one assume that on this dwarf ranking, Mime is at the bottom of the barrel? Well, I'm not going to go into all of that. This is what are known as the petty dwarves, and me being a character basically back in the Silmarillion. But I'm just going to put it out there that I think we need to reassess that with a slightly more sympathetic eye. For those who know that story, I think we just have to remember the petty dwarves. This is not what they called themselves. This is a mean name made up for them by the elves, and was actually probably the nicest name that the elves came up with for the dwarves. And this was how they justified their act of attempted genocide against the dwarves. Mim, as a character, when we run across him, is the last of his kind, the one and who with his two boys, the last who'd survived from that massacre, long massacre by the elves, and then while minding his own business, gets captured and forced to hand over his home to his captors. I think he may have done things that we didn't like, but I think we have to look at him with a little bit of sympathy in our eyes. It has to be said. He is not a character that we had. Reflective rambling. Actually, you're saying just the same thing here. To be fair, he had a lot of things going against him, and the person whose story he's a part of makes me twitch violently. Well, exactly. Charis Ballerina, what do you think the everlasting darkness called upon the Feanorians in that oath was? A great question. Rather than give a half answer, I will come back to that one and try and answer it next week, if that's okay. Martin S. Saying, what temperament made the Noldor so seemingly susceptible to pride? It does not seem to be the same case with Vanya or the Teleri. Well, whether it's all of them susceptible to pride, or whether it's just that line that we have coming down of Feanor and his wider family. Galadriel I count as being part of that wider family. Why are they prideful? I mean, it's hard to say. It's not all elves are the same is probably the shortest answer. We have the Banyar, who are just too good to be true, really. They go off and they live on the mountain of the gods, and we barely hear from them because they're just living their lives. The Teleri, kind of like some of them are proud, it would have to be said. But the Noldor, certainly when they got to Middle Earth, we have to kind of view them through the light of what they now must think. They must think that they are immortal with the light of the trees of Valinor, having come into Middle Earth with all of these non-immortals around them. And they must have thought that they were above such people and such things. And should we sympathize with that? No, we shouldn't. But at the same time, we can understand where they came from. They had been around. A human comes in to meet some of the Noldor, and the human has lived 30 years. They've lived thousands of years, and the human claims to have some knowledge of something, and it's like, no, I know more than you about this. So it's understandable, even if it's not perhaps something we should sympathize with. Akatosh Ore saying, just wanted to say thank you to Robert and the mods. I always put on your videos to fall asleep, but I do watch them at least once before I do so. Well, thank you. I've long past gone past the point of feeling that anybody needs to apologize for falling asleep to my videos. As I say, only thing is, if you put it on a playlist, so when you're asleep, it goes through all of the playlist. I'm sure the algorithm would love you. Well, it would love me. So thank you very much for that. Callie Summers saying meme and the petty dwarves sounds like something that J.R.R. Tolkien would say was just how the elves recorded it, and that's where the lore of the Red Book came from. Yeah, exactly. It's this is one of the things I did a video very recently. Who wrote the Legendarium in world, which was one of those things I thought, this isn't the most catchy title, maybe wouldn't get the most views, which I think I was probably right on, but I think it's a really important point, is that in world Tolkien always held this kind of writer's conceit that he wrote this, but he was relying on manuscripts that he had come into possession of. So actually all of these things were written by other people, and you couldn't go back and see who was supposed to have written each individual thing. And some of them we know about, so we know who wrote The Hobbit originally, that was Bilbo, and then Frodo wrote The Lord of the Rings, except for the last chapter, which Sam wrote. But then you can go back and you can even see who is it that wrote the part one of the Silmarillion, who was writing these other things over here. And the moment you start getting into that, you actually, whereas we often, and I have often in the past as well, talked about Tolkien's writings as being very kind of objective, rather as opposed to George R.R. Martin, who makes a big play on the fact that everything is coming from different people's subjective perspectives, different point of view chapters all the time. Tolkien does do that, but at a slightly more meta level. It's only when we take a step back that we go, yeah, so some of those stories were told just from the elves' perspective. Some of those stories perhaps don't tell everything that we should know about. It's even the name petty dwarves, it's not what they would call themselves. And it's this shows it's Tolkien and some of his best writing. He doesn't draw attention to it. He doesn't point at it. He just leaves it there. And we're at some point we're supposed to go, well, hang on a minute. Petty dwarves? Is that what we're supposed to say? Are they petty? No, they're not petty, not in the slightest. They're just dwarves. GG81 saying, how do you rate John Rhys Davies as Gimli? Do you have anyone else better in mind? I don't have anyone else better in mind. I think he did a great job with what he was asked to do. So having sort of critiqued the decision to make him more of a comedic character, I think he carried that off well. And I think the biggest compliment you can give is the fact that now every dwarf after that, not just in Rings of Power but wider, has some hint of his performance, his accent, for example, in there, because that is what we now understand as dwarf. In the same way that, for example, when the original BBC radio dramatisation of The Lord of the Rings came out, and it had playing Sam, I've forgotten his name, having got halfway through the anecdote, famous actor, but now he was pretty unknown at the time, was playing Sam, and he did him with a Southwest accent, which meant that in everyone's minds that's what Sam sounded like, and that was what Sean Astin then based his accent on when he was doing Sam. So when you do a characterization that is just so on point, everything else has to follow from that. I'm sure someone in the chat is going to remind me in a moment of just Bill Nye. There we go. Oh, thank you very much. He was early in his career and was going by William Nye at the time. And no, this isn't the science guy, Americans. It's the actor. Martin S. saying, in the Noldor's defense, I guess Thranduil's father, Orifer, marched ahead like a moron and got many wood elves killed while Gil-galad fought Sauron. So I did. I've come quite a long way round on Thranduil over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. It has to be said. My starting point for a long time with Thranduil, this is Legolas's dad, the Elven King in The Hobbit, was I didn't really like him. I mean, I thought Lee Pace did a fantastic job portraying him in the Hobbit films, but as a character, I didn't really like the character that much. Without fair trial, he imprisoned the dwarves and kept them there indefinitely. His immediate thought was to go and grab somebody else's gold when he could. He was tasked with keeping Gollum and failed to keep Gollum. He'd also failed, it has to be said, to keep the dwarves. They managed to escape. He seemed to willfully look the other way when in the south of his kingdom, Sauron was actually hiding there and building his empire. And Greenwood the Great turned into Mirkwood because of the growing presence of Sauron and evil in it on his watch, and he just retreated away from it. And for a long time, I just had this view, basically, he was pretty incompetent and quite nasty and greedy on top of that. I have recently come around to a slightly more nuanced view, which I think is where Tolkien's coming from on this, which is that and this stems from Martin, what you're talking about, his father Orifer. This is way back in time. He marches down to attack Sauron. At the end of the Second Age, he heads down to attack Sauron outside Mordor, and he is full of pride, and he marches ahead when this is with the last alliance, and we get Gil-galad and Elrond's there as well, and Elendil, but Orifer basically ignores orders and just goes charging into attack and loses huge amounts of his troops. Almost certainly his son was there, Thranduil. And this was such an horrific loss of life. When you remember in the Lord of the Rings, when they come to the Dead Marshes and you get Sam and Frodo and Gollum going across and you see the faces in looking up at them from the marshes under the water, that is from there. That is from that battle. And this, I think, is one of those few moments. Tolkien was very strong not wanting this to be about his personal experiences. No writer can ever truly divorce themselves from their personal experiences in writing. And one of the ways that this came through is this, and I think he did basically admit it, is that this is a memory from when he was in World War I in the Battle of the Somme, which was a horrific battle. And this was a sort of almost like a flashback memory for him. And what happened after that, we're told with Thranduil. Thranduil heads back up to Mirkwood. He's now the new Elven King. He's going to be ruling what will become Mirkwood from now on. But from that point onwards, he wouldn't ever look south without, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but without fear and chill in his heart. And basically, what Tolkien is describing is somebody who went to war and returned with some sort of post-traumatic disorder, stress, syndrome, something along those lines. Tolkien didn't have the same kind of language that we have these days to be describing that kind of thing, but it's very clear that was what Thranduil seems to be going through. And when you look at it through that lens, suddenly you can go, okay, so now we understand how he can allow half of his kingdom to be taken over by evil without confronting it, because he can't face up to what happened in the past. He cannot possibly lead his forces south to be confronting evil because of what had happened before. And the moment you get to that, you have to go, okay, yeah, we may not like everything that Thranduil did as a character when we get to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but we have to empathize for him. And at a very personal level, I think Tolkien got him and understood him, and he put a little bit of himself into him. So, yes, that's my new defense of Thranduil, having hated on Thranduil for a long time. Which I hope partly answers your question, Martin. G81, by the way, I should have said thank you very much. That was a very generous super chat. Mark Shisa saying, that's another reason for me to dislike Feanor. He gave the Noldor a bad name and caused them problems for millennia to come. He did. Akatosh Ray saying, I enjoy watching Robert's opinions change and evolve. I think Tyrion Targ is one he switches on. Yes. I mean, this is, for me, this is one of the, I can't remember whether I've given this thought process recently, but yeah, I tend not to be the kind of person who says, I have a theory about a thing and I'm going to die in a ditch over this theory. If something new comes to light, whether that's in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, if we get new information, a new book, fingers crossed sometime, maybe, who knows, I'm very happy to throw all of the things that I've spoken about in the past away and say, so this is the new idea of what we think's going on, and I'm not going to be too closely tied to what I thought before if something new comes up, and I'm always open to somebody showing me a different way to look at something. And I think that is one of the things that I try to bring to this, as I say, not just Song of Ice and Fire, but also Tolkien, is that to when you do the analysis, when you get into these characters and you can understand them more as you're going along, it gives you a greater understanding of the depth that Tolkien went to in creating this astonishing world. So yeah, I'm glad you appreciate that, because it's quite an important thing for me. Reflective Rambling saying, can you confirm the theory that this stream was planned for when Helen would be away to save us all from her dwarf blasphemy? Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely true. Akatosh Ray just saying, Tyrion, actually on your opinions changing and evolving question, you're saying, I think Tyrion Targaryen is one that I switch on. Yeah, there's something I've said many times. It's every time I read my way through A Song of Ice and Fire, I change my mind about the likelihood or not of Tyrion Targaryen. I think where George has left it as a writer at this point in time, he could take it either way and it would work. Right. Just having a quick flick through the chat. See if there's any more quick questions. Mark Shisa saying Orifer just didn't want taking orders from a Noldor. Yep, that's true. That's part of what was going on there. Jules Holman talking about Bill Nye saying he was as brilliant at Sam as Sean Astin was. I would agree with that completely. Martin S saying, is Eonwe a strategic genius, do you think? This is the herald of Manwë, who we don't really see huge amounts about, but he's sort of he leads the host of the Valar, the host of Valinor, I should say, and to victory. Is he a strategic genius? I don't think we have enough information to say one way or another. There are very few with Tolkien, he doesn't actually, for all of the wars and battles that go on in Tolkien's works, he rarely focuses on like the big strategic picture of these kinds of things. He cares about the individuals within them, and they might be doing clever tricks in battles and things like that, but it's almost as if that's what he does with a battle. He will like zoom in, take the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, for example. We see a lot of it from Pippin's perspective, running around trying to figure out what's going on. Then we zoom in on what's going on with the Witch King and Merry and Eowyn, and then we sort of zoom out again. Then we're following Eomer a little bit. Then Aragorn appears, and he's sort of dotting us around rather than giving us this sort of here's the big strategic view. So in terms of strategy genius, it's often quite hard to see. And although we can take the step up, and I have done this in a couple of videos to try and take a step up about the battles and try to show the big picture about what was happening in them, doesn't describe it in quite that level of really want to glorify it. G81 picking up for Callie Summers, thank you, saying if Thranduil was really so great, why was he nor Orifer, as far as we know, ever counted among the wise? I mean, I'd say if he was so great, I don't think that he was counted as great. He was one of the powerful, but not necessarily one of the great or the wise. So his general approach seems to have been quite insular and not forward planning too much. He, as far as we can tell, the elven community that he ruled, its lands shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and he was out there feasting and having fun while Sauron was growing an empire in his back garden, basically. So no, he wasn't that great / wise, and I think that is why they were not Elrond and Gandalf and Galadriel were not involving him in their plans. Amy Smith saying, sorry if you've already discussed it, but the new Gollum game was a bit disappointing. I have no thoughts on the new Gollum game. I've not played it or seen it. So that's a shame if that is. I've heard some good reviews and also a couple of slightly less impressive reviews. I will, when I play it, I will let you know. Okay, so I think with that, I will start bringing this to a close. If you're watching, next week, actually, before we get on to that bit, next week, I did a switcheroo. I said we would have Aziz from History of Westeros on this week to talk about Clash of Kings. That's happening next week. So Aziz will be here. We're doing a breakdown of Book 2 of A Song of Ice and Fire. Last time I had him on to talk about Book 1, and it was really interesting getting his perspectives in on this. I've been re-listening to it, come to an end, and I just looking at that as a book. The way George R. R. Martin writes is he writes each chapter as often as he can like a mini short story, with a narrative arc for the chapter itself, but also the books. It's not as if he just like draws a line and says, "Oh, here we got this far in the story. Let's draw a line." Each book has an arc, and so that's what we're going to be trying to look at, is what is the arc of Book 2 of A Song of Ice and Fire, Clash of Kings? Where is that taking each of the characters? How is that overall arc reflected in the characters that we have. So that's something to look forward to for next time. If you're watching this back a little bit later, appearing around here, it's going to be a link to other live streams that I've done appearing somewhere around here. It's going to be a link to my Patreon page. If you would like to support this channel, then that is the best way to do that. We've suddenly got another super chat just come through, so I'll quickly answer this one. Jules Holman saying, what do you make of the age ratings of the films? What with the Dead Marshes and other supernatural horror? I personally think they should have been 15s or at least 12. I don't agree with 12A. So those are British age ratings. I don't know what the American age ratings were. I mean, I can't. Are they all 12A? I genuinely can't remember. I think. What do I think? I think the thing is that with all of the story, it is a family-friendly story which has got some scary elements. So I think that anyone who's doing the sort of the regulation in a particular country has to try and understand where they gauge that. And so I tend to the view that age ratings, it will depend entirely upon the person, what's appropriate. And so for some people, something might be quite triggery when they're a lot older than it is for other people. Yeah, I don't have a fixed view on exactly what the age rating for them should have been. I don't tend to the view that just having a number works specifically well. I'd much rather, sadly, life doesn't work like this, obviously, but I'd much rather be able to sort of sit someone down and say, okay, so this is roughly what the kind of issues that this is going to be covering, and then people can make an informed decision for themselves. I hope that made sense. Anyway, thank you so much to the moderators. Thank you, patrons. Thank you all for the fantastic questions. That's all for this time. Take care, everyone, and I will see you again next week. Bye.